All right, I'm here to talk about um, Nathaniel Peabody Rogers. Um, his years are 1794 to 1846. And one thing I want to say about him is he's as radical as any figure of that period anywhere in the world, I think. Um, Advocated a host of reforms, but the real emotional heart of it is radical abolitionism and all the conclusions you might draw from the idea that people cannot own people. Anti-statism, he's an advocate of animal rights, at least early in his career, absolute pacifism in the Garrisonian vein. Um, I've done a standalone book on him, collecting his writings, Herald of Freedom. That's the name of the newspaper he edited in Concord, New Hampshire for much of his life. Um, Now, even though Thoreau, there's a blurb on this book by Henry David Thoreau, and not too many people can boast that, I think. A blurb by Thoreau praising your writing. Thoreau did write an essay about him, um, in admiration of him, very much so, and of his writing. But even so, Rogers is almost unknown, and his work. And Thoreau actually suggests that it'd be excellent if someone would collect his work in a book. Um, there was a collection of his newspaper writings published in 1849, very small edition, published in New Hampshire, and but I think that's that. Well, that's the last time he appeared in any book, as far as I know. There are three of his essays as well in American Defiance. I thought I'd read you some passages because the stuff is very beautiful. Actually, I think he's a killer polemicist, man. And if you were looking, I think of him as directly American Transcendentalist. Okay, and a major figure in American Transcendentalism in a variety of ways. Emerson also expresses admiration for him in his journals, but unbelievably unknown. One problem with other transcendentalists besides Thoreau and Emerson is they're just not that good. They're not as good as Thoreau and Emerson as writers. Fuller, I think that's true. Even Theodore Parker. Anyway, Bronson Alcott for sure. But Rogers is. Now, they're usually short pieces written on a tight deadline for a newspaper, so they're somewhat different. But the political stuff is even more pointed. He's one of the great political polemicists I've ever read. And he's also a beautiful nature writer. You have to sort of, rummage through to find some of that stuff, but comparable to Thoreau. I mean, not as elaborate, because again, the pieces are usually short, but really quite good, and I think quite an influence on Thoreau as a nature writer as well as a political thinker and writer. I'm going to try a few passages out on you. Here's one of my favorites. Rogers was an advocate of free speech, comparable to few, and an exerciser of free speech, comparable to few. This is pretty typical of him on that topic. Human speech is sovereign. Nobody can govern it but the individual it belongs to. Nobody ought to think of it. Everybody has his hands full with his own, which he can manage and ought to, and which he cannot innocently commit to the management of another. It can be done. Speech is good for nothing unless it be done. Men better be without tongues and organs and powers than not to use them sovereignly. If it be not safe to entrust the self-government of speech to mankind, there had better not be any mankind. Slavery is worse than non-existence. A society involving it is worse than none. The earth had better go unpeopled than inhabited by vassals. Pointed, eh? All right, I thought I'd try maybe a few other bits here. Here's an anarchist piece from a little essay called Politics. And among other things, it expresses his kind of his pacifism, which I think largely derives from Garrison, or at least is partly inspired by Garrison, and takes very much the same form. Although he develops into more of a direct action resistance mode by the end of his life. I mean, he died pretty young, and at one point he says, just flatly, slave owners should be hanged. All right. So, I mean, by that time, he seems to be out of the pacifist mode. But here he concludes in favor of anarchism from pacifism. And one thing I'll remark is that anarchism follows from pacifism because government rests on force. He says this is from 1843. Political action is of one spirit and intent with military. The weapons of both are violence, and the instrumentalities of both bloodshed and murder. What is government, after which all political action is aiming, but an armed battery? What is its voice but the report of cannon, its sanctions but the bayonet and the halter? It is immoral to strike a man, or threaten him, or to ask the sheriff to do it for you, or the militia officer, or the governor as such, or the penal lawmaker, or the voter. Moral action is addressed to the moral qualities of a moral being and does not act physically on the body and animal senses. There is nothing reformatory in animal action. The very beasts are injured by this political sort of corrective and reform. Good farmers are learning that there is a better way to treat their cattle than by blows. The hostler of intelligence and kindness is ceasing to maul his noble horse. They are leaving off the practice of breaking steers and colts for the reason that it is cruel, undeserved by the horse, and unworthy of the employer, and because the whole horse or ox is better than the broken one. Political action is unfit even for brute animals. Is it fitter for man? Is humanity less susceptible of moral influence than what we call brutality? A politician is but a man-driver, a human teamster. His business is to control men by the whip and the goad. His occupation would be unlawful and inexpedient even toward cattle. And, that passage is directly echoed in some of the writings of Thoreau, I think. I'd have to dig it up, but he makes quite the same point. And given that he was reading Rogers, I think it's likely that the influence is direct on that and many other points. Thoreau's anti-statism and his abolitionism, I think, come in part from Nathaniel Peabody Rogers. And he, as I say, acknowledges the inspiration. Well, there's some really amazing polemical moments in here. I hate to be this brief. Let's try this, though. The rights of animals. Now, there were advocates of animal rights, particularly in Europe in the 19th century. Few this radical, I think, and I don't know of many in the United States in this period. 1845. A man has rights, and they are important to him because their observance is necessary to his happiness, and their violation hurts him. He has a right to personal liberty. It is pleasant to him, permanently pleasant and good. It is therefore his right. And every creature, or I will call it rather every existence, for whether created or not, they certainly exist, they are. Every existence that is capable of enjoying or suffering has its rights, and just mankind will regard them. And regard them as rights. The horse has rights, the dog, the cat, the rat even, real rights. And these rights are sacred. They are not to be invaded. Mankind are to study the happiness of all beings so far as they are connected with them. How far is it to be carried? How far it is to be carried depends on how far the most perfect goodwill can carry it. Farther than it can go, it is under no obligation to go. Does anybody seriously think it right to trifle with animal happiness and animal suffering? They do trifle with them and talk about dominion over them being given to man. All right. as I say, the nature writing is really, I love it. I've blogged and republished an essay called "It Rains," for instance, which is great. He has several wonderful descriptions of storms. But I thought I would just finish with a passage about a book called Cobbett's American Gardener. The thing is still in print, I believe, widely celebrated and enjoyed. You know, a 19th century guide to gardening in America. But the way that Rogers describes the prose style of Cobbett seems to me to be pretty applicable to his own prose, which is more plain spoken than either Emerson or Thoreau, often at its best, and you know, written for newspapers, and yet very sophisticated, polemically, argumentatively, and poetically, but in a really kind of like direct American vein that none of the other Transcendentalists consistently achieved, or I guess we're trying to achieve, to be fair. So here's his review from 1842 of Cobbett's American Gardener, a little bit of it. This work on gardening is a modest, unpretending book, like all sterling productions. It is written in a style as beautiful as the subject and as natural as a garden ought to be. It is worth buying for the style of it, aside from the information it contains. Everybody can understand it at a glance without a dictionary. And the book that can't be ought never to be read. These books that abound in dictionary words are learned nonsense and imposition. Cobbett's Gardener is full of short, everyday words which the people can understand as readily as they can tell an onion stalk from a cabbage plant. You will find whole lines of them uninterrupted, every one as full of meaning as it can hold. The beautiful, strong, old Saxon, the talk words, words for use and not for show. Every young man and woman who has been injured in their talk and writing by going to school ought to buy Cobbett's Gardener, or some other of his works. A young collegian should read it twice a day till he gets well rid of his pedantry. Cobbett will cure him if anybody can. "Do you teach your sons Latin, Mr. Cobbett?" asked a gentleman. "No," said the common-sense sage, "but I learn them to shave with cold water." A bit of learning worth more to a man with a beard than all the Latin the monkery ever preserved from the ruins of Rome. All right, that's Nathaniel Peabody Rogers, my hero. And I must say, this is one thing I'm proud of in my whole scholarly career, is that I found Rogers and, dug into it and republished it. I think it's a discovery, one of the few things that I've discovered that people weren't already familiar with, most people. So, go get Herald of Freedom on Amazon, paper or Kindle. I think you'd be glad you did. I hope you'd be glad you did. Okay. Later.